Hello, my name is Jack Scott. I'm Chancellor of the California Community Colleges. Students, faculty, and staff entrust us with a great deal of confidential information in the community college, and therefore it is our responsibility to protect and manage this information. We have put together a video through the collaboration of the California Office of Privacy, the University of California, and California State University. It is an excellent video, and I encourage you to watch this free training video so that you can incorporate the very best practices in terms of managing confidential information. Thank you very much.
Morning. I'm Joan McNabb from the California Office of Privacy Protection, and Kent Wada, unfortunately, was unable to be here. He is ill, so I'm going to do my best to deliver his material, which is excellent. As the true academic, he made some valuable contributions here. So I'm the chief of the California Office of Privacy Protection. If you hadn't heard of us, we are a small organization in state government. We're 10 years old. We're basically education and advocacy, so we don't enforce any privacy laws. We have a hotline and an email box, and we field a lot of questions from about 80% are from individuals, 20% are from businesses or government or even higher ed. We, in addition to publishing consumer education materials, we also publish organizational best practice recommendations on privacy. And Kent Wada, who is not here, is the Director of Strategic Information Technology and Privacy at UCLA, and he works on two boards concerned with policy, one at the UCLA level, the Advisory Board on Privacy and Data Protection, and then also a new working group at the UC Office of the President on the Presidential Initiative on Privacy and Information Security. So he's deeply involved in the academic world on privacy issues and information security as well. What I'm going to cover today is an introduction about the value of privacy and security, and then an overview of the legal and policy framework that underlie information privacy and security, and then some information on a team approach to data governance for managing privacy and security. More about that later. After this session at 10:45, there will be part two, which a couple of other people will present, one of my colleagues and an information security officer from Cal State Sacramento. And they're going to cover the path from law to policy to procedure and give you a look at a detailed list of resources that you can use in developing a program on your campus. So, the value of privacy and data protection. The quote on this slide is from Justice Brandeis back in the early years of the 20th century, who called privacy the most comprehensive of rights and the one most valued by all civilized men, the right to be let alone. That's one of the definitions of privacy, the right to be let alone. So what is privacy? You know, why do we want to be let alone? If we're not doing anything wrong, you know, what are we trying to hide? What's the problem? Why should anybody be concerned about this? You may recognize this picture. This is a real-life version of a 19th century concept, the panopticon. Jeremy Bentham in England, a utilitarian philosopher, had this idea of an efficient and effective way to monitor prisoners would be not to have guards all over the place looking at every prisoner, but to have a centralized watchtower and all the prisoners around it, so that nobody knows at any one time whether he is being watched or not. And this is actually an Illinois State prison, where they do have that set up, and in the middle there is the guard tower. So if you're in one of those cells that are surrounding it, you may be watched, you may not be watched. You don't know. So the reason that's effective, obviously, is it affects behavior. It causes the understanding that they may be watched causes people to behave differently, and that, of course, is the point. So there is a privacy interest in being let alone, even if we have nothing to hide. The very fact that we are being observed, perhaps recorded, can change the way we act. That can be good in a prison, might not be so good out in the real world. So let's look at a piece of the real world, the academic world, and this slide discusses the relationship of privacy to one of the core values in the academic world, academic freedom. And there's a quote from the UCLA privacy statement. And the message is that a certain degree of individual privacy is a precondition of academic freedom. That if faculty, students don't feel free to explore concepts, research areas that because they're being spied upon and objectionable discoveries and discussions might produce bad results, they will self-censor. We will not be able to, in the academy, pursue the pursuits that we're supposed to. We will not be able to fulfill the educational mission in the academy. But it isn't just related to academic freedom, it's also related to the academic world as a workplace, that a certain degree of privacy of workers, of all of us in our workplaces, is a value to us. It makes us want to work in a certain place. The example here from a PC World article is of a clerk in an office who at lunch is looking up information on abuse victims. Because in the policy of this workplace, his boss is also seeing what his searches are. And so this is a deeply personal factor that he was not choosing to share with anyone, and it is not relevant to his work, and now it's being revealed because their privacy policy allowed that kind of monitoring. So it's not just vital to academic freedom, but to a respectful workplace for all of us, some level of individual privacy. But it isn't an absolute value. There are a lot of other issues and values and concerns that can cause us to not be clear about how much privacy to grant or to indeed curtail certain levels of privacy. Individuals have different expectations of what privacy is. There are certain laws that require us to gather or disclose personal information. Failures to privacy can lead us to have serious failures of some of our other responsibilities, for example, Virginia Tech, where at least it seems some of the college's understanding, interpretation of FERPA, the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, led them to not take appropriate actions. Or another serious consequence of a privacy failure at Rutgers was that student who was filmed by his roommate and then ultimately committed suicide, that the university's understanding of how they should handle that kind of behavior by the roommate may be a factor in that. I'm not assigning blame here. I'm showing that there can be serious consequences in the privacy arena. Changing technologies affect how much privacy, how we think of privacy, how much privacy is available. That remark of that characterization of privacy as the right to be let alone by Brandeis way back then was a response to a technology development, the development of the relatively instant camera. You know, before then it was the Matthew Brady type cameras where you have a big thing of black powder that goes boom, and everybody has to hold still for a long time, and so you couldn't possibly take a photograph of somebody without the person knowing. But with the kind of Brownie type camera, you could. And somebody took a picture of a wedding party in a home, and it was published in the newspaper. And Brandeis was decrying the invasion of privacy that this new technology made possible. We see that kind of thing, new technologies every day, bringing up new privacy concerns. Research can the needs of research can interfere with privacy values. An example from UCLA, a computer science professor who wanted to do research on developing better search engines. And so what he proposed in his research project was to collect all the Google searches from the campus network and then the responses and analyze that to look at ways to improve. And that the campus institutional research board said, no, can't do that because our electronic communications policy prohibits monitoring. So you can see how that policy, seems like a good thing. On the other hand, that type of research may have very great value. They are now reevaluating the policy, but for now that wasn't allowed. So privacy has to be enabling and not disabling. Another example from an academic context is when the email, in order to prevent spam and spyware and bad stuff coming in through email, the filters were so strong that a number of faculty decided they'd just use their Gmail accounts to send perhaps confidential information because it was easier. So you can't make it so tight that it gets ignored. So it's a balancing act. It isn't an absolute value. There are lots of values. So let's look at the mission and how privacy relates to the academic mission. So there's the UC mission, Teaching, Research, and Public Service. And here's the community college mission, as I can discern it from the Chancellor's website about lifelong learning for the community, preparing the skilled workforce and an educated citizenry. So how does that relate to privacy? Well, in a couple of ways. Protecting data is necessary. Many kinds of data is necessary because of laws and regulations, and if you don't comply, then you're not going to be able to accomplish the academic mission because you'll be in trouble. Privacy also enables the mission by enabling academic freedom and creating an ethical workplace environment. So it's both, it can be an enabler, and not acknowledging it can be an inhibitor. And of course, privacy isn't just an academic value. It has a larger societal value. It's not just an individual right. It's not just the right of the individual versus the right of the collective. In fact, a certain degree of individual privacy has societal value. In a democratic society, we need autonomous, free thinking, free speaking, free associating individuals to make our society work. So it is actually a societal value, not just an individual value. And a lot of the times in debate on competing values, it's cast, it's discussed as if it's just the individual versus the many, and so the many will win. So I'm suggesting that that isn't the only way to think of it, that there is a value to society. Now, what I'm talking about today, what I will be talking about, and what the second session will be talking about, is an approach to managing privacy, information security, and other data requirements that is being called out in many places of the world, data governance. So it's data focused. And the concept is that by identifying data of concern, that's what Motorola calls it, all the kinds of data that you have in your organization that you have certain special handling requirements for. So this includes things like personal information of students, faculty, staff, anybody else's you might have. It also includes information security information, like information on your network security. It could be the organization's financial information, like bank accounts, copy-protected data, other intellectual property issues. So there's a lot of kinds of data that require special handling, and by managing it all together with a data governance approach, you can enjoy some efficiencies and increase effectiveness. And we'll talk about that operationally in the last part of this presentation, and then more in part 2. So first, I've talked about the value of privacy, why it's important in the academic world, why it's a value to all of us in a democratic society. Now I want to talk about the legal and policy framework for privacy and data security. That it's not just a value that we should respect. There are many laws and policies that require us to do certain things that acknowledge privacy and security. Not all of the laws and policies I'm going to discuss apply to all community colleges or all parts of community colleges, but not all of the colleges all of the time, but some of the colleges some of the time. And indeed, there are some common themes that run through these laws that are effectively standards that can give guidance even if a specific statute or a law doesn't apply. So the basic framework that applies potentially to community colleges is here. There are some California laws starting with the Constitution and statutes. There are some federal laws and regs. And then there are some other standards that apply to certain aspects of community colleges. So all the ones in red are the ones I'm going to talk about right now. And in part 2, a couple of the other ones will be discussed. So let's start with the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution does not have an explicit right to privacy. But the Bill of Rights contains several provisions that provide privacy-like rights. They talk about this as being the penumbra of the Constitution, the sort of the shadow of the Constitution. So the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to protect what you read. Those are a certain degree of anonymity. Those are privacy-related rights in the First Amendment. The Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure, that's a privacy right in your own home, in your own records. The Fifth Amendment about decisional privacy, the right to make decisions in private. That's the without interference. That's where Roe v. Wade is based. Also against self-incrimination in the Fifth Amendment. All of these rights from the U.S. Constitution are against government. So government may not infringe any of these rights. The California Constitution does have an explicit privacy right, as do 7 other states' constitutions. Interesting, I think, is that our right to privacy, safety, and happiness is not just to pursue it, but to obtain it. So I hope we're all getting our constitutionally guaranteed quota of safety, happiness, and privacy. Sometimes I'm not so sure. It's Article 1, Section 1 of the California Constitution. And this applies to businesses and private actors as well as government. So it's actually broader than the privacy rights in the U.S. Constitution. In many cases, it includes some of the very same rights, but it's broader because it applies outside of government. So the first California statute I want to talk about is one that applies to any person or entity. So very likely that includes community colleges. And this is a law that was passed in 2003, and it was passed based on a concern about identity theft and about the risk of identity theft that the overbroad exposure of Social Security numbers creates for individuals. So, and its aim is to reduce the exposure. So it prohibits publicly posting or displaying Social Security numbers in general, and then has specific prohibitions. You can't print it on a ID card for access to goods or services, so that's why it isn't on the student ID card. That's why it isn't on your health plan ID card, even though initially this was just a California law. The major health plans changed their practices nationally. It also prohibits mailing documents with a Social Security number on it to an individual unless there's a law that requires it to be on the document. You find that many times documents are mailed with the Social Security number on it, and the understood authorization is, I am authorized to collect that information, but not necessarily to print it on this document going through the mail. Obviously the intention there is when mail is coming in, the recipient doesn't know that that mail is going to have that Social Security number on it, and mail theft is one thing that identity thieves do. It prohibits requiring somebody to email a Social Security number to you unless it's encrypted. So it's an incoming prohibition. That's a good practice. An outgoing prohibition would be advisable. And it is prohibited to require somebody to use it as a website login unless they also have to use a second password. Again, as a best practice, we think it's better not to have it be a website log on at all. This law, like many of the consumer protection laws in California, is enforced indirectly by the state unfair competition statute, which makes it an unfair business practice to violate a law. So if you violate the Social Security Confidentiality Act, you have automatically violated Business and Professions Code 17200 and following, and that is enforced by, can be enforced by the state AG, by district attorneys, and there are penalties that include $2,500 fines per violation, injunction, disgorgement of profits. So that's a pretty basic privacy law. The Public Records Act, which applies to state and local government agencies, and has some, in a way you could say it's the anti-privacy statute, but it has some acknowledgement of privacy. And right in the early parts of it, in its intent language, it indicates that the legislature is mindful of privacy, and yet people have a right to know what government is doing on their behalf. So the Public Records Act, in a couple of its provisions, kind of embodies some of the challenges in implementing privacy, and that it brings together apparently competing values. The value of the public's right to know about government, open government, and the value of allowing individual privacy. So is it possible to keep an eye on government without spying on individuals overly? So there are two places in the Public Records Act that specifically address that issue. One is the privacy, quote, privacy exception, which exempts from Public Records Act personnel, not personal, personnel, medical, or similar files, the disclosure of which would constitute an unwarranted breach of privacy. And then there's the balancing provision, which allows withholding from public disclosure something when the public interest, when the agency judges that the public interest would be better served by not disclosing than by disclosing, and that can be used sometimes to withhold certain amount of personal information in public records. The general practice in state agencies is to redact personal information. So not withhold the record, but redact the personal information. So if you have a question, write it down and do it. This law is enforced by us. An individual can bring an action to compel the records. That's how you enforce this law. The data breach notification, probably the most famous privacy law in the country in the past 10 years, probably does not clearly apply to community colleges because it applies to agencies defined as state agencies and to any person or business that conducts business. So community colleges are not state agencies. Whether certain aspects of community colleges could be considered conducting business, I don't know. I'm mentioning this because it has relevance, even if it does, I believe it has relevance for community colleges, even if it doesn't literally apply, because notification in the case of a breach of sensitive personal information has become a best practice and an expectation of individuals and an effective practice in mitigating harm, so that many legal counsel advise notifying because it's a good defense against negligence claims, because the intent of it is to give consumers, give individuals early warning that their information of the type that is sought by identity thieves has gone astray, so that they can take defensive action to mitigate the harm that could occur. So that's the intent. And it requires notification when personal information as defined, originally it was just name plus social security number, financial account number, or driver's license number. Later on, medical information and health insurance information were added as knowledge of medical identity theft grew. So that was a couple of years later after the law was first passed in 2003. Requires and this information is qualifying for notification is unencrypted computerized data. That's the language of the statute, generally understood to mean digital. But who's to say that a piece of paper spit out of a computer containing that information isn't computerized, but the general understanding is that it means digital. It's the policy of state agencies, however, to treat paper breaches of this kind of information the same as digital. If that information is acquired by an unauthorized person or reasonably believed to have been acquired by an unauthorized person. So these are the stolen laptops or lost laptops, hacks into the servers, lost packages in the mail of records or data tapes, all those things. A new way to do it every day, it seems. And this, like the Social Security number law, is enforced through the unfair competition statute. There isn't a specific penalty in the breach notice law. It's in the unfair competition statute, again, so the state AG or DA can enforce. Individuals can enforce under that statute if they suffered property or monetary damage. And generally, courts have not said fear of possible identity theft because my data was breached. That hasn't worked so far in court. This law has probably done more for information security practitioners than many things in recent years, in that it revealed the cost of insecurity of insecure data by trying, well, it costs to do a breach notification. Now, a breach always had a cost for somebody, to the individual potentially, but just nobody knew why it happened. The most recent survey on identity theft, which found that there were 8.1 million victims in 2010, also surveyed people who had received breach notices and found that people who had gotten a breach notice were 4 times as likely to have become an identity theft victim. That doesn't mean it was because of the breach, but there's certainly a correlation of some sort. you're probably, I would think, pretty familiar with FERPA. There it is, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Gotta learn that. That protects student educational records, and it applies to any educational institution that receives federal funding, which is, up until now, pretty much all of them. And it limits the disclosure of records requiring consent in general of the parents if they're minors or the students themselves. There are certain exceptions. And there is an opt-out right that must be given to including certain basic information called directory information in campus directories or released to advertisers and others who want it, name, address, etc. And schools are required to give an annual notice to parents or students giving about their rights, including this right to opt out of having their directory information made available. And it's enforced by the U.S. Department of Education. Those laws, as well as some of the big private sector privacy laws like HIPAA for healthcare providers and plans, like Gramm-Leach-Bliley for financial institutions and financial services companies, have certain features in common, and they are all based on the Fair Information Practice Principles, which are a set of principles that organizations are encouraged to follow, that to recognize the privacy rights of individuals, the rights of individuals to control their own personal information. So these principles were first articulated by the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the early 70s as the government began amassing more and more digital databases and realizing that they could collect a lot more personal information, do more things with it, retain it longer, and that they wanted to stop and figure out how they ought to be guided, what policies ought to guide them in managing this new wealth of data. And now they've moved along and become recognized by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development as underlying the ability of data sharing for trade, for business purposes between countries. And they underlie the European data protection laws, the Canadian data protection laws, which are comprehensive, and in several other parts of Asia. And also pieces of them are embodied in American laws, which tend to focus on different types of information or industry sectors other than being comprehensive. So transparency, don't collect personal information in secret, let people know what you're doing with personal information. Limit the collection to what's necessary for the purpose. Specify the purpose for which personal information is being collected, and use it only for that purpose unless you go back and get consent for another use. The information should be timely and accurate and relevant. Individuals have a right to see their information, question, seek correction. The data has to be secured from unauthorized access, etc. And an organization must be accountable for its policies and practices regarding personal information. So those principles underlie basically all privacy laws. We don't have laws that embody all of them. So now I want to talk about the team approach to data governance, about how an organization can manage privacy and security with existing resources. And I know we all have limited and more limited everyday resources. So this isn't a brief for everybody needs a privacy officer now or a data governance officer. This is how we can do it with what we've got and who we've got. So, a couple of case studies. And this approach is being used in a lot of private sector organizations as a way of more efficiently managing data themselves. So one case study is the California Department of Consumer Affairs, and this came about because the Office of Privacy Protection initially, back in 2001, was part of the Department of Consumer Affairs. So since we were housed there, even though we are outward facing, we said, well, we'll be your privacy office too. So we pulled this together. The Department of Consumer Affairs, like any large organization, has lots of different units in it. And Consumer Affairs has the doctor board and the barber board and 40 or so different boards, as well as administrative divisions, all of whom collect lots of information. So we created a privacy team of representatives of all the different major program areas, the major boards, also other big data-related operations in the department, HR, obviously, information security, internal audits, because they have very good skills, IT in general. And with the team, we developed a couple of initial objectives. And one was to find out, we called it a privacy inventory, actually, find out each piece, what personal information do we have and where is it? And also what our current practices and written policies are for using it. And then the reason for doing that was the second objective, to get rid of unnecessary Social Security numbers, where we didn't need to collect them, or unnecessary uses of them, even if we needed to collect them for a related use, where we didn't need to keep them so long, to find out where personal information is, particularly Social Security numbers, and then get rid of Social Security numbers. And the result, and this was about, all in all, I'd say a 6-month process, was to stop the use of Social Security numbers on attendance and travel forms, which involved programming. Wasn't just, and then ultimately changing the forms, but initially programming, so it wasn't needed. It wasn't the, it was no longer the index for keying in the information. Those documents drove people crazy because they floated around the office as if they were nothing, and there was their Social Security number every month, all the time. Also, one of the unnecessary uses that was determined was when license renewal forms were sent out to doctors, barbers, pharmacists, accountants, time to renew your license, they had the Social Security number printed on the renewal notice because it was in the system, and the system printed out everything every time, no matter what you told it. And it was not used, it was ultimately determined. Nobody was using that and processing that renewal. So that took more programming and more form change, and that was actually the critical path, not the the programming, but actually changing the forms that were already out there. And then finally, looking at all of the forms that were collecting personal information and putting a privacy notice on the forms, which is required by a law that applies to state agencies, and which is a good practice in any case, to tell people, here's why we're collecting this information, here's our legal authority to do so, here's how it's going to be used. And the thing about the notices is, in order to put the notice on the form, you have to actually figure that out. Why are we collecting this? What is our legal authority? And along the way, a number of the components discovered that actually they didn't have the legal authority for that particular purpose, or they didn't have a business need any longer. They might have once, but no longer. So let's not do it. So that was the project at Consumer Affairs. Here's a UCLA project. So the Consumer Affairs project, we're calling it privacy, but you can see that there's data security involved in this as well, in the travel forms. One of the approaches we're looking at in those commonly used forms with Social Security numbers on them, attendance and travel claim, was, well, let's just, because initially it was thought, oh, reprogramming is going to be a nightmare. It's going to be too much trouble. So let's just make the forms let's handle them more securely. Let's put them in envelopes. Let's have them the way our pay stubs come, all folded and perforated, sealed and things. Well, of course, that costs way more than what turned out to be 4 hours of programming. It wasn't quite as bad as they envisioned. And handling paper securely can be very challenging. You know, it requires a lot of people to do the right thing a whole lot of times. So we determined that it was, from a security perspective, it was actually more efficient to do it at the source, stop needing it on the form. So, UCLA. They have, on the campus, they have an advisory board on privacy and data protection. So data protection encompassing information security and other data-focused rules. The members are appointed by the high-level executive vice chancellor, and they represent not just faculty and staff, but also students. And their charge is to develop their basic privacy position, to update, in some cases, their policies on privacy to accommodate reality and what their values are and what the expectations of the campus are, and then to, on an ongoing basis, address privacy and data protection issues as they arise. So one of the issues they addressed was that one about the search engine research, so where the initial was, well, it's against our policy on electronic communication, so no, you can't do it. But we recognize this is not the best, this is not the optimum solution. Is there a way to accommodate that sort of research and recognize privacy rights? And so they are refining their policy there. Another example of an issue that they address is a way to deal with copyright in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. They considered a program that the University of Michigan uses called BAYU, Be Aware You're Uploading, B-A-Y-U, in which the network is monitored for P2P software. And if somebody is using P2P, gets noticed. Hey, did you know you're using P2P software, you're uploading? Doesn't stop it, doesn't say don't do it, it's just awareness, the understanding being that to some extent people may not be aware. It could be, as I'm sure you've had incidents, we certainly hear about them periodically, where people don't know that P2P software is on their computer and it's sucking all their data out. UCLA decided not to use that they wouldn't use that approach, that again, the monitoring was still against their policy, but also they were concerned about record retention. How long are they going to keep the information on who was using and wasn't using, and then when they kept it, then who is going to have access to it for litigation purposes or other purposes, and now they're in a bigger policy dilemma than they were. They also recognize that there are legitimate uses of P2P software, and that demonizing that particular form, it may not be appropriate. So they decided not to use BAYU. But they gave it good consideration. As I said. So if you are to start a data governance program on your campus, how would you go about it? Obviously, as with practically everything, executive sponsorship is critical. Often, the way that such programs start is because of a data breach, which tends to get executive attention. I'm sure some of you have probably found that out already. as an efficiency measure, this can be a way to talk about it with executives as well, since you already have, and I'll give you some ideas where, you already have people working on data, and they can obviously work more efficiently together rather than working in their silos. And make a plan about locating the data, and then start with a high risk issue. And I recommend, it can be good to start with employee data because you have the enthusiastic attention of the team members. And then you can go from there, because they can see if they're handling their own, if your organization is handling their own information badly, you know, how well could you be handling your students and other people whose information you have. So it can be effective. We did that at Consumer Affairs, that first got people's attention. So I'm calling this discovering the team, because I'm not saying create the team. You've got a team there, they just don't know it. So the CIO or somebody from the CIO office, an information security officer if you've got one, somebody in records management, the registrar, obviously, somebody in HR, somebody in student loans, financial aid, a lot of data, a lot of requirements there. Somebody internal audit, they're so good. And somebody who deals with research or intellectual property or copyright. So it's just some of the people who have data responsibilities already. When you get them focusing together on ways to streamline and to actually broaden a little bit the world that they're covering also, you find that they become hyper aware of issues even outside their own little scope, and they become sort of like the data governance police. They start noticing things going on out there. There's a good stream of issues that need addressing that come in. Now, anybody could be the leader. A logical leader is the information security officer, or maybe internal audit. It could be any one of these people. And with any team, you want to start off with a win if you can. You know, so locating the data of concern can be a good place to start. This isn't like a gigantic project. This doesn't have to be a gigantic project. With a team made up of those key people, you're going to know, okay, we've got all the student data is in this database, and this database, and this database, and it's this kind of data. You'll see in the resources that we'll give you at the end, or maybe, and they're going to go over it in the next session, that we've got some tools for doing a fairly simple data inventory. If you've already classified your data, you would have a data inventory, but I don't think anybody anywhere has actually classified their data. Also, records management people very likely have some level of inventory of different kinds of records that could help you identify ones that have data of concern in them. That's the way we started Consumer Affairs, because they had to do an annual record report to General Services, so they had data sets already, records systems already itemized, and that was a good starting point to identifying what's in those. The kinds of data that might be of concern are, as I mentioned earlier, that it's not just personal information. You know, it's also things like the college bank account number. You know, that's certainly something confidential. And then focusing on some high-risk issues. In the next session, they'll talk about risk assessment, but so obvious high risk, being high risk to individuals and to the organization because of that. For example, Social Security numbers. You know, I think most of higher ed has done a certain amount of work on Social Security numbers because of having to change the student ID numbers. But it's amazing when you start looking how many times you're collecting them on ancient forms when you actually don't have a business need for them anymore. So starting on looking for opportunities Back in the day, when they were student ID numbers, faculty tended to have them on class lists. And where are those class lists? Are they paper? Are they on computers? Can you get rid of them? There's no reason to have those. Websites can be a good place to start. Are all the data collection forms online secure? We did some informal scanning of a bunch of higher ed websites a couple of years ago and found no, they weren't. Just basic stuff like that. That's another place to look at whether you're collecting information you don't need. And are there any appropriate privacy notices when you're collecting personal information? Even if it's not required in every case by law, it's still a best practice. And another good place to start is with credit and debit card information. You know, wherever you have that, there are contractual requirements there, and you can hear more about that in the second section. So here is how to get in touch with me, how to get in touch with Kent, and we would be happy to provide any assistance as you march along. Also, this session and the part 2 and these slides and the resources list will all be posted online in the near future on EDUCAUSE's Community College Community of Interest page, I think that's what they call it, on CISO's site, on my office's site at privacy.ca.gov. So we want to make this available to those who couldn't attend. And we actually see this two-part series today, the two-part course today, as the first of some ongoing sessions. We'll do another session on data inventory or privacy inventory in the future that may just be a webcast. So that concludes our session. Now we can have questions.
We are going to be recording this session, and I'll give a little bit more detail at the end when we stop the session and where this information will be located, what websites. So this is Managing Data Privacy and Security in Community Colleges Part 2, as I like to say. I'm Deborah Castanon. I'm from the California Office of Privacy Protection, and this is Jeff Williams from the California State University at Sacramento. I work for the Office of Privacy Protection. I've worked there for about 5.5 years. Our office is we deal with education and advocacy. We are not an enforcement agency, but we do assist consumers with privacy-related issues. And we create recommended practices for businesses and organizations, including some very good recommended practices such as security breach notice, confidentiality of social security numbers. And so we have a toll-free number. We also have a website if you want to contact us.
And I'm Jeff Williams, the Information Security Officer at Sacramento State. The key part of my job right now is just enabling secure processes, do a lot of training, do a lot of work with the technology groups to help them build the technology in a secure way, kind of recognizing that we first need to meet the needs of our community, and then how can we secure that need. I think really my job, though, is a terraformer. Everyone here knows what a terraformer is, because we're all kind of techie geeks. So a terraformer is when you take like the moon or some other planet that's not hospitable by human life, and you basically try to change its atmosphere, you try to change it so that humans can live there. Well, that's pretty much what I do at Sacramento State, except for the difference is the hostile environment is the security, right? The security practices weren't there. Our process was built without security in mind. So really, I'm trying to change the atmosphere of Sacramento State, the technologists, the end users, the community, to understand really how security is here to help them with their process. And hopefully I'm here and I can share some lessons learned about kind of where we're at in this process and give you some takeaways.
So here's a brief outline. We're going to discuss just briefly the laws, which were actually discussed in more depth in part 1. We'll go in more about policies and procedures. We'll also talk a little bit about risk management, and then we'll do an overview of the resources that we have. We'll also have a list of those resources. So let's get into some of the laws that go to policies and then to procedures. The what, the why, to how. So getting started. So this is really scoping out your policies, practices, and risk management for a data governance program. Now we realize that many of you may have a data governance program or board, and yet we also realize that there are some entities in the community college area that do not, and so this is a starter program for you. These are things that you need to be looking at as you start looking at your programs.
And what I like to point out here is that this is 3 bullet points, but this is all hard stuff to do, right? To get policy through, to change practices, to do risk management, because we don't want to secure everything. We want to secure things that are high value, that have risk to it, right? So by getting started, what we're going to try to do is we recognize the state of the budget, we recognize the resource limitations. So we're going to try to cover, to me, what I call our asymmetric approach of how can you be in position to get your policies through? How can you be in position to be doing risk management? Where can you start to change your practices now to achieve some level of security in your current environment? Recognizing that with no more budget, there's a lot more resources. You don't have to face security officers, that type of stuff. So what are some of the lessons learned that we've had? And how can you get started and position yourself for that when the budget does get better, that you can be pushing these policies and these practices through?
So with data governance, it's good to lay some foundation, some understanding about data governance in a whole. So, you have your laws, and those are very specific about what you can and cannot do, usually in response to some kind of issue that's going on in society, such as security breach notice laws, because there were so many security breaches that were occurring. Policies really are the what and why. They're the rules for your organization. And then practices and procedures are the how. It gives you more of the detail of what you need to do, or provides more of that information to other entities within your organization about what they need to do. Risk management, it really identifies the areas where you have risk and where you may need some of these rules. And then communication is really, you really can't have enough of this. And this is one of those soft skills that you're going to need to ensure that you have. So as you're communicating to your executive body, your data governance body, or those at a senior level of management, to articulate that risk that's occurring. Are you in compliance, or are you at risk? Certainly those skills that we tend to not think about, but need to have.
And what I'd say is policy is very important, because that shows that the executive management really says this is important, we need to put resources to it. But what we're going to show here is that I think some of these policies, you already have requirements out there that you can really leverage to already say that we have an impetus to do something. We're going to focus a little bit more on the practices and procedures you could be looking at doing that will help you. Then do some risk management, more of compliance management. So not the full-blown risk assessment. Risk assessments are hard, but getting more into compliance management, so you can loop back up to those policies and say, now we know here's what's going on in our environment. Here's where we know we're not meeting the requirements that we have right now without any additional information security policies, because we have to do even more.
So typically, policies are handled by a governing body or a very high-level executive level. They'll also be those who will be making decisions on risk management and whether they're going to accept risk or not. Practices are usually those at the next executive level, the next level down, describing those procedures or developing them. And then staff may be involved with the actual risk assessment, since they know the body of area, and developing risk mitigations and assessments. So it really is a loop all the way back. And again, communication is that tool back and forth. So here are some policies for community colleges to consider. Now this is a very, it looks like a large list, and actually it's somewhat of a limited list. And these may not all apply to you. There are some areas that apply more than others. And again, you know, there are many good examples of these policies within other community colleges. They have more mature programs in state, like Sac State here at state colleges and at UC.
And so what I'd like to point out here is with policy is that you kind of have just a general statement of a, you know, we need to take information security seriously in our community college. And you have all the way to existing international standards like ISO 27002, which if you could just adopt that and say, you know, that's the policy, that's the practice we're trying to get to, you're kind of done. The problem with adopting a, you know, like an ISO 27002 is it'll take you 30 years to get there, and really a lot of those controls are more Department of Defense related, so some of those don't really apply. It's a great standard, it's a great thing to look to, but I think when you're looking at your policy, you need to take small bites out of this one. So if you look at what the CSU did, we took over 5 years to develop our policy, and our policy, you know, we said, let's put out a policy that will give us 5 years, so we can, that'll only go up to about 5 years. And then we're going to add to it, add to it, add to it. So when you look, there's so many different areas that you can really choose for a policy. You need to be very conscious that, you know, security is a very broad topic, and it can get very verbose very quickly. On our website, we have between the Chancellor's Office policy to our supplemental policy, which further defines it, to our guidelines and standards, we have probably over 200 pages. And this is our 5-year policy and documentation. And so as you look at all these things, you don't want to go there. And so just kind of know that you need to look at your environment and figure out where are you having risk, where are you having issues, what policies can you implement, and do it. Wonderful. But I wouldn't recommend looking at this list and just going for it. That's very difficult. That's very difficult. I think you really need to focus on kind of some short-term policy wins, and we'll go into that here just a little bit.
And as you're creating policies, you're going to want to look at maybe baby steps, the first ones that you begin with, and you want to vet those policies with your community, with your stakeholders. Because I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, policies that are created that are so strong, and then everyone finds a workaround. So, you know, like email, if you lock it down, if you can only do these things, you're going to find your faculty then going and not using their standard email for, let's say, you know, private information, sensitive information, but using your own personal account just because they need to get the work done. So you really have to think these things through. You have to work with your community to see what will work and what won't.
Right, that's an excellent point, because the last thing you want is adopt a policy that you're not going to follow. That's your worst manager comes in and finds that, then you don't have a policy at all. So when you're doing your policy, know you're going to grow it. In your policy, you're going to have this gets reviewed annually and updated annually, because you want to start small. You want to say, you know, we have only 3 requirements now. In a year, we're going to put 2 more on, so we're up to 5. And you just want to kind of grow that over time.
So we actually went over this list of laws in part 1, but here they are just briefly again. And we're going to focus on 2 of these areas, red flag rules and PCI. Now PCI is really it's a standard, but you can think of it as somewhat of a de facto policy, because if you aren't in compliance, then you will not be able to go through these type of transactions, which are very key to some critical business programs, whether it's, you know, financial aid or your bookstore, your campus bookstores, things like that. So PCI, again, this is a standard, but it does exist for a reason, and this is actually something that affects many of the cardholder transactions that occur, and it's for that safe handling of that information. And it covers any of the businesses that store, process, or transmit payment cardholder information.
Yeah, the key part about why this exists, and I think why it's relevant in the discussion around policies and talking about laws here, is it really exists because the credit card industry recognizes that if it doesn't have these types of standards out there, the government's going to come in, like what they said, like with the FERPA, and say, here's what you need to do, and then we'll all have to get on our Ouija boards and figure out how do we actually implement that. So basically, the credit card companies took the lead in saying, well, what do we really need to do to protect this? And to me, they're doing this to avoid this becoming codified into law and to really give themselves more flexibility in what those requirements are and try to make it more, if you will, more practical to pure credit card transactions and less political through the government process.
Which they know will cost them more money.
Yeah.
So what's required? Well, there are actually 12 requirements in this framework of assessing, remediating, and reporting. But it really gets down to some of the requirements being such as installing and maintaining a firewall configuration to protect that credit card holder data. Not to use vendor supplied defaults for things such as passwords and other information. To protect that stored data that you have, to encrypt the transmission and to do vulnerability assessments. So those are just a few of the 12 requirements that need to be in place when you're handling cardholder information.
Yeah, and I'd like to make this relevant, so just kind of a show of hands. Who here on their campus is processing credit cards? You touch credit cards, not you personally, but your bookstore, your financial aid, your cashier's office, your food services. They get everybody's hands at this point. So to me, this is a requirement you already have. It's in your environment. And so that's why we're really focusing on this, because this is an area that's very narrowly scoped. There's actually very few people that need to follow the PCI requirements. It's a very well-defined requirement. So to me, this is a very good one and a kind of a bad budget time to be focusing on, because there's nothing new. You already have this requirement. You already have to address it. And really, this is, to me, one of the more draconian ones when it comes to controls. Now, what's nice about that is that by focusing on the PCI, doing your assessment, and figuring out where you have gaps and what you can and cannot do, that's really going to help you understand your security control environments you can put in your community college. What's going to really make sense? What's scalable? Because I'll tell you what, a lot of it's not. And the last thing you want to do is make policy because you think something's scalable. This gives you the opportunity to really flex that process into a very small, targeted group of people. And I find these are the people that want to play because they like taking money, because they need to take money. This is all about customer service. So they have a self-interest in working with you as a technologist or an information security officer. So to me, this is one of your win-win environments that you can go into and that you really need to go into.
This is also, because you have to do it, it's a good area to learn from if you're starting your program. So learn from your business entities on how to get these policies in place.
Question. In your institutions, who generally handles PCI compliance? Is it managed out of the finance, business operations end, or is it managed out of the IT end?
Sure, excellent. And let me just repeat that so that we got that on the mic here. The question is really who manages the policy, who manages the PCI compliance in our organization, correct? That's really important. So in our case, what we do is we work with our controller. And there's a link here that shows our one-page policy that basically says the controller is, the president signed a policy that says you have to go to the controller to be certified to process credit cards on our campus. They're the ones that have the most interest. I'll tell you why. We have over 20 direct credit card processors on our campus, and that's not including all the food services. And the issue is we're using different accounts, different merchant IDs, but in some cases the same bank. And the last thing we want to have happen is one organization have a compromise, and we find out that the bank they're using, these other three entities on our campus are, and they're shutting down all of our credit card operations for that processor because they're saying we're weak here, and they view us as one merchant. Just because we look at ourselves as 20 different entities doesn't mean that's the way the processors or the banks are looking at us. So to me, you really have to have some authority over it to say, you're hurting all of us. We're all going to be in the newspaper. It's not going to be clear that this is your fault. It's going to be the campus's fault. So in our case, the president signed a policy for the controller in charge of that. And then my office, the information security office, I help them with the assessment because there is a lot of technical goo to that, and they would never understand that. So they say, yes, you can do it, as long as Jeff, you do self-assessment with Jeff. Is that, yeah. Okay. So the other thing that I really like about PCI is it has a lot of requirements, and it's pretty clear what the requirements are. But the problem is a lot of the requirements are really hard, and some of them are really easy, and it really depends on your environment. So I can't just say, you know, here's the 20 ones I know you can do, here's the 5 that are going to be hard. You have to look at the assessment, you have to look at the standard, you have to say in our environment what's going to be easy, what's going to be hard. And that's going to be your technical infrastructure and that type of stuff. So really what I'm advising is you go through the PCI standard. My next slide, I'll show you our website. We have a lot of templates and resources you can take a look at and figure out where it is. But you really need to focus on the ones you can do now. PCI is not something that you just magically arrive to. It's a pass-fail test, and you get one answer wrong and you fail. So you can't come out of PCI saying first year we're going to be compliant. If you can, you're awesome, and give me a call so please do this training so I can learn from you. So you have to realize you're going to have to mature your PCI process. It's a draconian process. And so I just grabbed a few of the controls up here. So there's password requirements, there's verifying your traffic's encrypted, there's detecting rogue wireless access points, there's firewall rules, both inbound and outbound, and there's lists of authorized user devices. So this is just of the 100 or so controls. Here's some of them. And I was kind of thinking of this. I was working with my 8-year-old doing some homework, and they had the little, you know, here's the things, put them in the order. And so I was thinking, here's your takeaway, or here's your little thought experiment here, is really in your environment, which ones are easier for you to address. So things like list of authorized users and devices, I'll tell you what, you have an inventory form. It's pretty easy to go to the business user and say, who are the users that use the system? What are the card swipe devices by serial number? What's the workstations that are involved? What's the infrastructure involved? And so to me, this was like first on our list of, yeah, we can do that real quick. And now we have a check that we have some compliance. Not compliance, we're moving toward compliance. And to me, that's important because what happens is if you get a breach, the credit card is going to want to investigate. Another campus had an issue where I think it cost them 30 grand just to have an investigator show up at the front door before they start investigating. And what you want to be able to show them is, look, we didn't just turn up blind eyes to this. We may not be totally compliant, but we've done half these things. And to me, you're now doing damage control and you're doing feed control. You're trying to have them assess a smaller feed against your campus because feeds are debilitating. So that's something that we can all do pretty quickly. That's pretty easy. You have things like password requirements, which may or may not be easy. So you may be on a central domain controller, you control the policy, and you can say, yeah, we can expire passwords every 90 days. Yes, we can enforce complexity rules. Or maybe your PCI system is a standalone application, and maybe it doesn't support that. You need to take a look at it. Or maybe it supports it, and you can go out to the PCI website. They'll show you what products are PCI compliant. The reality is that just tells you what can be compliant, because you may not have configured that vendor's policy requirements appropriately, or you may have dumbed them down. So password requirements is another one of those things that maybe it's really easy for you, maybe it's not. But take a look at it and you decide, is this something we tackle now or something we tackle later? Verifying traffic is encrypted. That's kind of fun, getting the network team involved and saying, is credit card data actually being transmitted encrypted? You know, I don't know if that's something you've done in the past. You know, do you have a resource limitation on who can do that type of work? So that might be hard for you. It's something that a lot of people don't typically do, is look at rogue traffic. Detecting rogue wireless access points. I love this one because what it's basically saying is we're a campus. We're open to the public. As far as I'm concerned, our network is like the internet because we have so many different people hooking up their own personal equipment on a wireless, all that kind of stuff, that for us to control it, that's very difficult. But one of the things on this PCI requirement is that you are monitoring your airspace quarterly, and you're shutting down rogue access points. And why is that? That's because if you look at some of these big exploits, it's been around wireless. It's been about bad guys coming into your environment, installing a wireless device, so it's sniffing your traffic and broadcasting into the parking lot. So things like that. Well, that's kind of hard. You know, who has time to go do that? I mean, it's only quarterly, so you could go, in theory, go do it with a laptop. But you know, that's something that a lot of us don't do because we are so open and public. So maybe that's something you can defer off to. I love the firewall stuff because everyone knows what a firewall is, and of course it's the golden bullet when it comes to security. No, it's not. But everyone typically addresses inbound rules. And you look at the requirements for PCI, and that one's actually pretty easy because we all get inbound rules. Like we only allow these clients to come talk to us. Here's the issue though. It also addresses outbound rules. What can your system talk to going out? And it's supposed to be locked down. It's supposed to be denied by default, and you will only allow it to go out to the things you say you go out to. You have to have a proxy server it uses. And so this causes a lot of issues because we're not used to, networking people are not used to locking outbound. So guess what? You have to have antivirus on it. Well, where do you get your antivirus update? Because that has to be a rule to go in. Where's the application get its updates? Where does the OS go get its updates? And so you really need to come up with a model to do all that. That's hard. You know, the inbound is pretty straightforward because not a lot of things exist. And when we start talking about outbound, and then, you know, your networking guys like, you know, hey, just give me an IP address. Well, I'm sorry, Microsoft, the update server can change. You don't want to hard code it. Or we have a connection to PayPal. Matter of fact, we have this in Sacramento State, where we have a connection to PayPal and our application goes out to it. So what we did, we implemented a proxy server. And that's awesome because we just put in the domain name, and then it resolves the IP address to whatever it is today. So I don't care about that. But that required us to get not just our networking team involved, but also our server team involved as well. So outbound's hard and probably something that you're not going to be looking to do anytime soon. So to me, what you have to do is go through these requirements, go through the assessment. Actually, if we go to the next slide here, kind of what my team did. And I was lucky. I had a staff member, Adam Cook, who came out of Chase and did a bunch of PCI work. We came up and we created training material. But what we found when we first went out to the assessment is we just said things like inventory log, and people were like, "Oh my God, what is that? That sounds so hard." We're like, no, it's not. So we went through, and this is cut off, because it would probably go down to about right here. We basically created a bunch of examples and guides of here's how you can start getting compliance with this particular requirement. So we provide, and these are pretty straightforward. And then here's some resources, some templates that you could also just take, and change the name on them, and then you put your data in it. So I'm highly recommending that you, there's this site, there's the @ONE site, has the PCI stuff. There's also, there's a PCI training that just happened here, which apparently on learnsecurity.org, they're posting a lot of this material out there. So this isn't something that you have to get a consultant to come in here and do. There's a lot of references out there to help you get started. And so what I'm going to advocate is that this is a good way, this is a good start, because you don't really need a policy. It's great to have a policy to say the controller has to approve this type of stuff. I put a link if you want to steal what we have. That's a wonderful thing. Right, is you can start doing this stuff now, because a lot of this stuff is IT focused, and you're running IT. So any questions on this? I can kind of keep going and pray that. You're safe.
Now, in every environment, we have a student network, a password network, and wireless system. Administrators as well as staff. So we need to apply rules to credit card transactions.
Well, it kind of depends on your network infrastructure. So, okay. So the question there is, we have many campuses have different zones on the network where they have academic zone, they have lab zone, student zone, and the question is, does this apply across the board? And this is where I say no, but you could get an assessment that says yes. So what we did was we made sure all network traffic is encrypted, because I'm assuming when you're on my network, you're on the public. We are as if you're on the internet. So any requirement that would be for internet traffic, we have for traffic on our network as well. So that's kind of how we did that. We have a lot of core routing, that all the stuff's really touching the same router. So that router really is PCI compliant. But the requirements to lock it down are pretty draconian. So you really have to think about it and look at your architecture and come up with what's in scope, what's not in scope. But the key is, I would say, assume your network's all the internet.
How are you using your confidentiality agreement?
So the question is, how am I using my confidentiality agreement? This is just, so I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, other than to say there's a requirement that you train staff that touch credit cards, and we wanted them to sign an agreement that they've been trained and that they will maintain the confidentiality of that information. Because you'll have a lot of workers that are really trying to do the right thing, and maybe they're too ambitious, maybe they're too helpful, and so they'll do things like record credit card numbers because maybe that person wants a refund later, and now I can match it up and refund for them. No. You don't do that. The system does that type of work. So to me, it's really kind of saying some of those guidelines and rules, and it's a signature that says you've read them, you've been trained, you know not to do this. Questions in the back? Head shaking? Head stop shaking?
And so one thing that you mentioned also is don't be surprised that workstations aren't necessarily just a cashiering device. You can also find them in workstations that appear to be just normal workstations.
Yeah, well, I love this. This is a big thing that we found in our environment, is you'll go to an area where their job is to take credit cards as part of the process. And here's their computer. And this is the computer they go to Pottery Barn with, that they go listen to iTunes on, that they check their email to. It touches the internet. And so how many people allow their cash register to do this type of thing? You know, unless you root it over there and do stuff. And you don't. So we really went to a dual system to where you have two hard drives, you know, two separate systems. One's your cash register system. One's your, I do my regular work system, and we do some KVM back and forth, so I have one keyboard, one mouse, that type of stuff. But you know, really, that's part of these requirements. And looking at budget, that's kind of hard, because now we need to have two network connections coming to an area that's potentially pulling more cable. Maybe you don't have switch ports in the closet, so that could be a problem. You have the expense of having two desktops, right? So I mean, these are things that you need to be evaluating, and you need to be trying to address as best as you can, and you need to be prioritizing what can we get done this year, and what are all the gaps? Because as long as you have those gaps, you're still not compliant. That's the reality.
So the other area that we want to also focus on are red flag rules. And this is actually enforced by the FTC and other areas, depending upon whether you're a financial institution or not. But it exists to prevent identity theft. It detect, prevent, and mitigate the effects of identity theft. And because there were growing numbers of identity theft, that's why this came into being. And it covers creditors who ordinarily do this type of business, which are these three criteria. They obtain a consumer report in connection with a credit card transaction, furnish information to consumer reporting agencies in connection with a credit card or credit transaction. And here's the key here for many of the community colleges, is advancing funds to or on behalf of someone to accept for funds for expenses incidentals to the service provided by the creditor to that person. So again, it could be financial aid, it could be your bookstore, so you have to look at this in your area where it might cover. It also covers financial institutions, which I don't necessarily think apply in your area, but that's what the rules apply to. So it's there, and it's to identify these patterns and create practices in your organization to give you a signal about identity theft, and to so that you can identify and prevent identity theft from occurring. This doesn't mean you have to reinvent the wheel. This is not some new set of rules that you may not already have in place, especially with maybe some of your business entities such as bookstores. They may already have steps in place so that if there's a address change, they verify certain pieces of information already. Let's take for an example, and this is separate from community colleges, but let's take the Postal Service so you kind of understand how this works. You know, if you, with the Postal Service, they will send you a card if you are moving. So they'll send a card to the current address and the new address. So if you're not moving and you're getting a card, you know something's going on. So it's those type of procedures that you need to have in place so that you can verify that there's not these patterns of identity theft, or that identity theft can occur, such as an address change. And you want to verify that that is actually what's occurring for that entity, that person. Who enforces this is the Federal Trade Commission, and if you're a financial institution, other federal financial regulators. So again, you're going to want to look at these, and you're going to bring in your business owners and technical staff to deal with some of these issues.
Yeah, so this was a great one at Sacramento State, because I got pulled in very early on it, because obviously it has something to do with security. And so we identified, well, really who does this apply to, our financial aid or cashiering group. So we pulled together this kind of cross-functional group of business leaders. I chaired it, and we had the advantage of, I think, two things. One, UCLA came out with a great document that really talked about what are the, and please don't quote this number to me, but like 23 things you need to be looking for. I mean, it really spells out what's the intent of what you're trying to do, and what fraud are we really looking at trying to do. So they really distilled a lot of these requirements into a consumable document. But the meeting started out with, let's read this and just ask each other questions about what does this really mean. Now, the Chancellor's Office, through Cheryl Washington, basically, I believe, took that and created a CSU version, which we can make available as well. And these documents really kind of just helped us talk about what the heck is this even, what are we supposed to be doing here? What are the requirements? And the other thing that was really nice about this process is after a few meetings, it became very clear that this really is a technology issue. You can put a lot of electronic reports and flags in here. The reality is, when we looked at this process, this is a lot of these requirements are just how to do good business if you're doing loans, if you're doing financial aid. So we found a lot of the stuff was already codified in the procedures, and some of them weren't. We had to update it. One thing that was kind of difficult for us at the CSU is you look at how do you profile fraud, and it's like how our students come to Sac State, right? So they apply for a loan at their home address, and then they want the money when they show up to Sacramento State, and they've moved. That feels like an address change to me, right? We should apply. So we had a great time trying to figure out, what's our threshold for these things, because really this is like half our student body that would be flagged every time. We can't support that. We were able to show company controls with the same account that you used to manage that process and your address change was the same one you used to register classes. It's the same one you used to take courses. It's the same one you used to use our labs, to use our wireless. So what we were able to show is through our security controls of your account, we know that's you that did that address change, because if you didn't, you couldn't be going to class. You would fail, right? So the majority of our cases, we're able to show how we already had controls on the technical side where they're going to be calling the registrar and saying, I've been in class and I can't log into the learning management system, right? So that was probably the closest technology thing that we were able to provide for them, is we provided some ways to identify, to detect when an account was compromised. But the reality is most of the stuff is just process, business process. So as a technologist, this was a nice one to like chair and say we need to do this, but it became very clear that this really has not much to do with me, and it's really all about you in the business process. Let's do by identifying the need. At first it looks like it's all systems because you got flag things, right? Well, humans are primarily our biggest flags when it comes to this type of stuff. It's pretty complicated. So I'd recommend taking a look at this implementation guideline. I'm pretty sure that includes the UCLA kind of primer on this. Review it, call me with business folks, and it's really just more about updating your procedures. So this is a case where you're not re-implementing anything. This is really just looking at your existing processes and updating it, and you're becoming compliant.
So as you're going through some of these examples, you start to look at, okay, where do I start from here? You're going to start going into risk management. You're going to be looking at your data, what data you have out there, doing an inventory, then you'll be classifying it. Yes, it is important to know where that data is located, because it could be in a variety of different places as it moves through different systems. You also want to protect what you found. Do you have the appropriate security controls in place? In addition, are you in compliance with some of those federal and state laws? And then provide your management with a risk management plan.
And here's where I just have this recurring theme I keep wanting to say is that, again, I realize budget time, lack of resources. Really what you're trying to do is position yourself so that kind of on the upswing here, you can get to these security policies. As a matter of fact, I don't like calling them security policies because I'm talking to folks. These are really operational policies. 85% of the security requirements are really just good business practice. It's going to make your processes stable for your end users. It's going to make them more available to your faculty, to your students. So I almost hate using that. But you want to be able to, what I want to see happening now is building data classification standards. Because that's something you necessarily need the executive team to sign off on. That could just be a work in progress. And you start talking about that you have this level 1 data, you can start identifying where does that data live. And if you focus on the red flag and the PCI, you have to do that anyway. So you could also be collecting looking presence and that type of stuff. And what you're really doing is you're creating how big of a risk do we really have here? So you're positioning yourself so that when you can start addressing policy, you can say this is a big problem because this is what we know we have in our environment. So you're really starting to identify where the data is, where it's located. you're protecting the data you have to protect now, right, through like the red flag rules and the PCI requirements. I'm not saying protect it all. I know, faculty have SSNs on workstations because historically we might have had them in rosters and things like that. Well, you got to get your own house in order before you go out there and adopt the Nimbus desktop. You'll be crucified if you say, we need to solve this problem throughout the campus, right? You really have to get your house in order. And to me, these are some ways that you can get your house in order. You could understand what your pain tolerance to some of these things and position yourself so that you can look at moving into a policy and adopting it into a broader context. I mean, what I really want, and I guess I'm getting less and less optimistic, I'd say 5 years ago, a few years ago, maybe I'll say 10, 20 years, is you want to have that full list of policies that we looked at before. That's going to be a long time to get there. And so this is going to help you kind of get that momentum to get these structured. And this risk management, what you're really looking at doing is it's really compliance management. Because I'll tell you what, risk management scares so many people. It is complex. What are all the risks? I'm a security professional, but do I know everything about a wireless versus a web application versus an OS? Versus physical security, what are all the issues? What are the new threats that are happening? I try to stay current, but I can't really know all that stuff. And that's not what I'm asking you to do here in this case. I'm just saying, hey, there's some requirements out there, and are you complying with them? So your risk assessment or risk management process, while it needs to mature, it can start with just compliance and say, where are we compliant, where are we not compliant? And that's pretty straightforward. And that's a report that you can get up to the executive team and say, we're just not doing this. This is lack of compliance.
So, yeah, here's a brief discussion on some of those risk management plans, risk assessments. You can find much more information about risk assessments and a management plan in a variety of sources, but really, if you don't have a program, a data governance program or a risk management program, you really want to start taking the baby steps of making a plan and looking at those high-risk issues. And if you want to create that culture within your community, your community college, your administration, your students. You want to start creating that culture, especially with your employees. Use the employee data as that first example to protect it, to find it, to locate SSNs everywhere you can. And please be aware that when I say employee, you could be also using contractors, and of course they may have tax ID numbers that are really SSNs, their own personal SSNs, and not an actual, let's say, corporation tax ID number, business ID number. And again, you can do things that don't necessarily take much money. It may take more time because it's a more manual process, but there are some data inventory tools that you can use that we'll talk about on the resource handout. And you want to look at the what-ifs once you come up with the risks that you have. If you have SSNs, what are the what-if scenarios? What if that SSN is disclosed somehow in the process of where your data lies? And if it is, what are the consequences of that what-if? And then write up those assessments and options. So I want to get a kind of a feel here of, did you start out as a security technologist, IT person in your role? Are you mostly IT? Okay. Or are you at a more policy level position? So most do come from an IT background. And as you're developing these assessments, there's one thing that we find that executives or governing bodies don't appreciate, and that's when you say in a policy you cannot, or even say, as you mentioned, risk. So you want to provide them with a good analysis and assessment and provide them with options. And it's going to be fairly clear when you provide those options which is the best option to select. But I'm sure you're aware that when you tell an executive no, it may not go over well. And you have to do it in a certain way as well. So a lot of this does have to do with communication. And as many IT professionals were educated, communication wasn't on the top of the list. But when you're talking about risk assessments, and maybe that's a scary term, but you may want to be looking at, for the baby steps, at compliance assessments. You'll get to risk assessments as your program matures, but perhaps you're doing right now just compliance assessments. When you're developing those assessments, and your analysis and your options and how you might mitigate it, you want to use easy to understand language, not the techie language that your executive or your governing body won't understand, especially with the acronyms, PCI, there's so many. They may not even understand what red flag rules mean. You also want to have a document that you can use as a pass-through document to higher levels of authority. Somebody that they may need to communicate with, like a board, a school board, or whoever may be making the decision on, let's say, funding. Something that's easy to understand. The assessment also, you need to be prepared to verbalize this, but it can't just be a verbal discussion. You have to have that document. And email does not count. You need to have that face-to-face with those governing bodies or those executives to be able to explain to them what this means, what the risk means, and again, we may not like that term, but what the options are. And again, be able to describe it without causing that fear in them. As soon as they hear risk assessments, we know they kind of shut down. So you're going to need to verbalize it in language so that it's a business decision. And again, those soft skills, you do need to practice. You practice with your staff. Practice coming to conferences like this to explain how you did it in your community. The more you can verbalize it, the better practice you are, and it'll come off great, and you'll be successful.
And this is also part of that terraforming thing. I mean, really, your end goal isn't to necessarily get that policy, isn't to get to the end game. It's to try to get your organization to start embracing this and to start moving in that direction. So to me, this is where you're trying to change the atmosphere on your campus and your location. You're trying to get better understanding that this is coming. You need to prepare for it. You need to be looking at change in your organization as systems come in and out. You need to be thinking about this. I mean, right now, in our area, we're mature enough that I can now say, if you're not changing your process, you're failing, because we've had 5 years of growing into this. And at this point, if you haven't heard the message, it's come down to the chancellor, it's come down to the president, it's come down to the CIO. We've been doing training, we've been working with you on guidelines. So right now, if you're just doing status quo, you're failing. But you can't start off with that. You have to start off with the meeting and greeting and really just trying to change the atmosphere, changing the awareness in your environment before you can get there. So it's going to take time.
So now we're going to go through some of the resources that we have. And so as we go through these, there are going to be some that you end up finding, whether your organization has them or maybe you find some other organizations that have some great resources. We'd like to hear from you to add those to the list. Now, we intend for this to just be the beginning of a series of podcast webinars that occur, because at the community college level, we found with the report that came out on FSN that it appeared that they didn't have mature programs. There were some, but maybe not such as the California State University system or the UC system. And so this was a report that went to the legislature. So they are looking at this report, looking at the status of community colleges. So it would be good if we looked at some of these practices from the community colleges and saw that more was going into these, because you're the legislature, they'd like to create policy to require other things. So if you're ahead of the game, that's great. These may help you get to that point. But also, use your other resources. Besides this list, use your community colleges, your community yourself. Create that community, in addition to using CSUs and UC. And so what I'd like to do is to challenge the community colleges that in the future, to provide more documentation here that can be useful, but also to join us for the next Secure IT, to be one of the speakers, to talk about what does work well in your community colleges in this area. So we'll start going through the resources here. Again, for the identity theft detection and prevention, the red flag guidance is on that link. And if you don't have a hand up, I'll put them in the back as soon as we leave, or as soon as the session's ended. Again, this is through the FTC. For policies and practices, there are some good links to Sacramento State University for PCI.
Yeah, so in this case, you asked a question. This is a link to that policy where it says the controller is the one that decides who can and cannot take credit cards on campus. And so it's a one-pager. You know, it's not anything brilliant, but it's a good start to see, you know, how are we doing it, and please look the language and make it sound smarter if you can, let me know. We have our confidentiality form, and that's actually not our form, but I couldn't find the CSU link out there, or maybe that is a CSU link. And really this was adopted throughout the CSU system. We have one for staff and managers, another one for faculty members. They're slightly different. But those have been vetted with the unions, they've been vetted with the attorneys, all that kind of good stuff. So could we have more on that confidentiality form? You betcha. I'd love for there to be more. But to me, it's a great start of where some of the requirements that staff need to have. And what the confidentiality forms really do for you is one, it does say there's some training involved. So you do need to put together some program. It doesn't have to be elaborate. You know, it could be 10 PowerPoints long. You know, don't share your password type of security thing. But it gets people to change their way of thinking. That, hey, this is part of my job as well. And I'm signing these forms that basically acknowledges that. So again, you're trying to change the culture of the organization. And so this is the other thing. The other reason you should be doing things like this, coming to conferences and speaking, is in my research I found at UC Berkeley a privacy statement has nothing to do with this presentation whatsoever. I was like, oh, that's a pretty good one for websites. It talks about what data you're collecting on your website and how you're going to handle that data. So I kind of just put it out there as I thought it was kind of interesting. I'm going to go see how I can go steal from them, use their materials, but also, you know, do these presentations and learn all sorts of fun things.
So again, with the privacy statement, that one in particular, you wouldn't be able to take that privacy statement and then for their website and then port it over to your website, because you may be doing something completely different with that data and what you're doing with it afterwards, after you've collected how you're using that. So privacy statements are unique to your individual website. And if you need some assistance with that, we have some recommended practices, and you can follow us as well. But again, some of these policies and practices that Jeff talked about, they are templates, information that you can use, but certainly you could add to it. You could modify it for your use. The privacy and security training, this is training that we provided throughout the state and specifically for one department. And no copyright there. So if you need something to provide your employees, this may be a starting point. You can download that. You can use it as you like. We have a signature page that indicates that they've reviewed this. So, you know, you want to start creating that awareness, especially if you don't have the training program. This is, you know, a place to start at low cost. In addition, it starts creating that awareness about privacy and security. And again, as soon as you say security, it appears that, you know, some people just get blocked off. They stop listening. If you say privacy, then they kind of understand. If you say identity theft, it's more internalized, it's more personal. So.
Yeah, I definitely echo that as well. On our campus, when we're doing a lot of security, faculty will initially push back until we can explain to them how this really protects their privacy, their confidentiality, their data that they hold dear. So I mean, that is where privacy really is in the benefit of security. Is it really shows one of the benefits that people can glom onto very quickly. Because we don't just secure for security's sake, we secure because we need privacy. Risk management, I love risk management. There's a couple different resources out here. So on my site for compliance risk management, on that PCI website, there's a self-assessment that you can use to say kind of where do we live. We also have a procedure in there where it really talks about, you know, one problem with looking at risk is you'll see so much stuff broken. And it's debilitating because now I got to fix it. And then you look, oh, there's something else broken. I can't walk out of my office without tripping over something that's broken. So what our process allows us to do is we have risk monitoring where we look, we say, look, this thing looks broken. It may not be broken, but from my initial lead and or maybe someone reports to me this is broken, we document it's broken, we get it to the CIO, and we come up with a monitoring plan. We're not going to fix it, and you know, we negotiate how long that plan's going to be. It could be a very long time, it could be a very short time, depending upon, you know, the system, the political scale of that system, all that kind of stuff. what we're doing on that monitoring is trying to figure out, okay, does the risk really live there, or do we have compensating controls in place? Can we transfer this risk? So if it's like a PCI system, don't do in-house development of your own PCI systems. Don't get a third party to come do it. This is their niche. So that's a case where we're really looking to say water monitoring, can we transfer it? Great, if we transfer it, we could pretty much, we'll come with a transfer plan and be done with this. If we can't transfer it, our next stage is risk mitigation. And this is where we have a form out there that as the ISO, I really am writing it up, and I'm meeting with different business owners, different IT folks. I'm saying, really, how are we not meeting the spirit of our policies? Where are we not meeting our policy? And what core mission are we really delivering here where you think that we still need to do this even though you can't meet the policy? And so they make their case, and then we look at, well, what are the compensating controls in play? Because the reality is, just because the policy says we have to do it this way, doesn't mean there's other ways the technology can secure itself. So if there's already other compensating controls, ways to manage that risk, we document that. In that case, that risk mitigation, if we really think on the scale that we've just balanced it out, and then we now met, if you will, the intent of the spirit of your policy, great. I take that as CIO, we walk them through it, he signs off and says, yeah, good job. We'll look at this again in a year. You better still be doing those compensating controls. In our environment, we can't assume risk. In our environment, the only person who can assume risk is the president. So historically, as technology has been built in our organization, you see IT folks taking all sorts of risks because they only have this much budget, so they do what they could. And the business owner doesn't understand the risk we just got into. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked about backup procedures, and it's like, well, if this goes down, your system's going to be gone for 2 weeks. Is that acceptable? And the business owner will go, no. Well, that's what was built for you. Do you understand that risk? So really, what I'm finding in our organization is there's just been so much embedded risk, and what they need to realize is the president said, here's the line, and it's kind of, to me, a low bar if you really look at security requirements across the board. Here's how much control you have to implement it. And if you're not going to implement this much, I need to be involved. I need to say, yes, this is core mission. Yes, we need to do it. And I'll tell you how that process goes. We implemented this in August. We've done a lot of risk monitoring. We've yet to do risk mitigation. You know why? Because as soon as a dean level person has to write why they're doing something that maybe not that secure, that maybe isn't that important, and they realize they're going to go to the CIO and try to make their case, and then if that doesn't work, they go to the president, they kind of go being silly. What else can I do to mitigate this? We're going to have cases where you have to be silly because, I'm sorry, the technology doesn't support that. It's going to cost us $500,000 to move off this. Let's just assume the risk for a year. So we're going to get there. I'm excited to see how it's going to work out. But really, this risk management process has made people really rethink what they've been doing and addressing the risk in the environment. So we have that on our website. I also included the NIST and the CERT here because really, when you think of risk management, it's a big process. It's a behemoth. It's hard. But ultimately, I think you need to kind of see where you need to be going. That's why I think this is like a good, by your nightstand, right next to the Constitution, you have these, this manual on risk assessment, and take a look at where you should be, where it should be going. Because the reality is, when you look at these controls, what you don't want to say is, here's 50 controls, and it has to apply in all places. Because what happens is then you get something that you don't really care about, and it's constantly with all modes of control. And so, but this risk management process really allows you to tier up your security, tier up your controls, tier up how you want to address it. Because as much as one standard is easy because you just do the same process everywhere, it's not attainable. You can't do it. So you have to have some. Here's one secure environment. Here's a more secure environment. And that's where PCI, HIPAA for healthcare, that type of stuff. Those are great environments because they naturally lend themselves to a small group, but they naturally lend themselves to meet these requirements. And you can really test your process and say, can we support this kind of security? And what you're going to find is we can't. It's not scalable to try to do this across campus.
So again, I think some of those key points that Jeff also made is know who makes the decisions on risk, who can accept the risk. It may not be you, and you want to ensure that too for your career to ensure you're still employed. Because if you're taking on that risk and nobody knows it, that could be detrimental to you. And again, know that there could be a governing body. It may not just be solely the CIO. It could actually be a body of the business owners and the technical and maybe the chancellor or vice chancellor's office. Also, there's a Social Security number links there. One is to our recommended practices on our website, which is very valuable recommended practice document. So many have downloaded that. And then the higher ed report, which is specific to higher education, where we identified where there were more mature programs and where there were some that were lacking. Again, data breach response guidelines. We have a very good recommended practices on the actual notice. EDUCAUSE and UCOP do have good resources for incident management. And if you have not gone through the process of a security breach, and you want to take a look at these. You do not want to be deer caught in a headlight looking, what do I do now? What's the steps? Because there's things that can happen because of forensics, which Jeff will talk about. You want to make sure that you have integrity of the systems so that if law enforcement is involved. Do you want to say anything about forensics? No?
Well, we're going to run out of time, I think, if you give me on that horse.
Okay. So we also have a data inventory and classification tools that are on this website. That they're ones that we use for a seminar that we provided, in addition to one that was actually part of the department's use, which they're low cost. They're not an automated process, but they certainly do the job, and they help you identify your information, your data. Additionally, we have the data protection and information security links specifically to the FCC guide, PCI.
Yeah, and here, so we link out to the actual PCI standards, which are awesome. Where I think they did really well is they said, you have to do this, and how do you verify you did it? So it's not just kind of giving you here's something kind of you should do, which I think HIPAA was kind of hit with. It's pretty specific, and it gives you some pretty specific ways to audit to say, here's how we know we're compliant. So to me, it gives you a lot better implementation guidance and understanding of what we're really trying to achieve on their site. And then again, on my site, and again, at one, there's a lot of the stuff that's already out there to help you understand what those requirements are and some templates to steal. I did link the CSU and the CSU our policy, because I think it's something to take a look at and kind of go, this is ugly, this is scary, we're not here. Recognize that you want to get there ultimately, and we're not the end game at this point, so ours is only going to grow. But take a look at the different sections we're covering and say, what ones really make sense in our organization to be working toward. I think you need to be forecasting out there. And what can our community college support? What should be our first policy that we really go after? I included SANS has a security primer security policy primer out there, which is nice because there's a lot of terminology and the intent of what it should be. But also, you guys already have some nice documentation out there that I'd love to see presented here, because it already talks about a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. And these websites also offer. So you guys have done some work. There is some good stuff out there. And then I also would like to start out say here the data classification standard. To me, this is where I think the CSU did a great job. Before we went for policy, because policy's hard, policy you have to get everybody to buy up on. We said let's go for a standard and let's go for a data classification standard, because what that's going to do is identify really how much risk we have in our environment. Because where's all the value? And if you look at our classification, we have like a level 1 to 3. All level 1 really does is it looks at all those laws and says, we have a requirement to protect this. That's level 1. So we didn't say there's anything crazy out there that we're going to protect this because we think this is important. We just went with what's law. I added some crazy things like vulnerability scans and some things like that, passwords that I think need to be included. But at the CSU level, they really try to keep it as these are laws. And this is going to go hit what we always say, the site OB, if there's an issue with this level 1 data. It needs to be of your choice. Your community. Level 2 really was, this isn't PII, personal identifiable data, but this is pretty dang close. There's other ICT laws coming in the future that's going to require us to protect this more and do breach reporting. So that's kind of how level 2 got created, and then level 3 was pretty much everything else.
So in conclusion, much of what we discussed is the policies, how you create them, how you consider a data governance body. That information that needs to go between that entity that makes the decision on risk, creates the policies, creates the procedures, that communication back and forth, and you're using the resources that you can, and create your community that will assist you. Use them as sounding boards. What have you used? Many times we're creating templates from other templates we've seen. We have no problem using other pieces from other entities and adding on to it. So, look at your other resources, create your community, as CSU and UC have, and they have offered to assist the community colleges in your area. So use them. In addition, I really challenge the community colleges to be involved in this particular event next year in Presency, and we can work through that and provide additional resources to community colleges.
I'd like to thank the Privacy Office for putting this on, because really privacy does drive a lot of security. So thank you for having me join you, and thank you for the presentation. And I would like to say that privacy is great because you have to keep a lot of things private. There's one thing you shouldn't keep private, and that's security. So I have something for you here. I want to see your security. I want you to change your environment. I hope that I'm wearing my security shirt. Am I wearing a shirt? So really what you're trying to do is Terraform. You need to raise the awareness. You need to raise why security is important. It's not for security's sake. It's for things like privacy, things to stabilize your environment so you can deliver for services. So thank you.
Thank you, and this will conclude the session. Do we have any questions?